Hello, everyone.
All right. Okay, so we're into, I don't even know what week it is. Doesn't really matter. This week, we're looking at assimilation and pluralism. So with assimilation, there are three dimensions of it. The first, there is cultural assimilation, and that is where a minority or ethnic group obtains certain cultural traits of the dominant culture, such as language, religion, diet, etc. The second dimension is psychological, and that is if they themselves identify and if others identify them as part of the dominant culture or accept them as part of the dominant culture. And lastly is biological. This is through the act of reproduction, generation after generation. Eventually, the newly introduced ethnic group begins procreating with the dominant local inhabitants, and eventually everyone starts looking the same. The manner of entrance is going to have an effect on this process. So, as you can imagine, where if people were war refugees, they're going to maybe garnish some sympathy from the local inhabitants. Or eventually, over time, they might be allowed to stay as part of the circumstance. If this war goes on for so long, then eventually they might just become accepted as part of the population. Or the cliche case and example of illegal aliens coming here to take our jobs. That scenario, people are going to be met with a lot of resistance. This speaks to the duration, so obviously if an ethnic group has been in America longer, then if they've had more time to be exposed to the dominant group, well, the dominant group is going to get used to them and, slowly over time accept them. So the more recent you are to a new location, probably the more hostile the locals are going to be. But if let's say people have been there for generations and generations and generations, well, they're going to have had more time to get used to you and be more accepting of you and your ethnic group. Say you're from like the UAE or you're Arabic or something like that. Well, immigrating to the US after the events of 9/11, not a good time. As you can imagine, there would be a lot of animosity, a lot of hostility towards people that obviously fit that profile. For example, throughout California, there's actually a large Sikh population, and a lot of these people get misconstrued as, Arabic or Muslim, and their religion and philosophy is completely different. Interesting to note, Sikhs can't cut their hair based on their religion, and so it's brought up a bunch of controversy with them being enlisted in our military because they're one of the few ethnic groups that don't have to abide by the normal rules, and so that's why you'll see them wearing their headdresses, their hair wraps basically, because their hair is super duper long, and it's part of like their sacred religion that it is by direct order from their god, their deity, that you do not cut your hair. More sacred to them than anything else. It's their display of devotion. Or if you were Cambodian, Vietnamese, Chinese, any one of these other Asian ethnic groups, after World War II or after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you can imagine basically everyone was hating on the Japanese. If you looked remotely Japanese, you were lumped in with them and hated on by your neighbors.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
I live in California last 20 years, but first come from Laos.
Huh?
Laos. We Laotian.
The ocean? What ocean?
We are Laotian. From Laos, stupid. It's a landlocked country in Southeast Asia. It's between Vietnam and Thailand, okay? Population 4.7 million.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
Oh.
So obviously quantity would impact a group's assimilation process. So whereas if it's like a dozen people from another country, not too many people are going to be mad about that. Whereas if like 100,000 some people immigrated to Southern California or something like that overnight, there's going to be a lot more outcry in response to that. Alright, and so the second aspect of all this is pluralism, and that is where an ethnic group is able to maintain elements and aspects of its former culture, tradition, traits, things like that, while also still residing within the dominant culture and, maybe taking on some of the qualities of the dominant group. But again, while maintaining still part of their originality, their traditions, their cultures, and keeping those things alive. With cultural pluralism, that is the maintenance of many varied ethnic cultures within the framework of a common economic and political system. The next would be structural pluralism, which is the continued social separation of minority ethnic groups from the dominant culture and perhaps from each other. Another type of pluralism is equalitarian pluralism, where a minority group desires equality with, but separation from, the dominant group, and the dominant group agrees to these conditions. This is where basically a minority group requests their own individuality and their own independence within the dominant culture, and the dominant society agrees to it. With corporate pluralism, ethnic units are formally recognized by the government, and politically and economic power is allocated to them on the basis of an ethnic formula. So separation is encouraged, and multilingualism is officially sanctioned. So that's like with Switzerland, where they have 4 national languages, which they are German, French, Italian, and Romanian. Again, these are all honored, viewed, and respected independently and as part of the collaborative culture. Now, there is also inequalitarian pluralism. Basically with that, think of it as colonial societies, where racist regimes come in and they legitimize by democratically establishing this ideology that racism, segregation, things like that are part of the culture.
Shrubberies are my trade. I am a shrubber. My name is Roger the Shrubber. I arrange, design, and sell shrubberies.
And there's really no hope for upward mobility. You're pretty much locked into that position. If you are born the son or a daughter of a laborer, well, you too are going to be a laborer. But if you're the son of a king and queen, or I guess a pharaoh and pharaohette, you're going to have a life of royalty and luxury destined and waited for you. There are also instances of forced assimilation. So if we think about like the Native American populations that were forced into reform schools, forced onto reservation lands, tragic stories.
In the whole of American experience, I'm not sure that there's any environment more tragic than that experienced in the government-funded Native American boarding schools. One of the things that you become aware of when you start to look at the Native American boarding school experience is the realization that what happened there has ripples that go through generations. And so what happened then, we're still seeing the effects of today. This is a generational trauma. The boarding school system was the misguided brainchild of a man named Richard Henry Pratt. The guiding ethos was essentially this: kill the Indian, save the man. On arrival, the kids were stripped of their clothing. They were bathed in kerosene or harsh lye soap to remove vermin. They were given uniforms. They were often given new white-sounding names. In the Native culture, hair is a sacred element, and these kids had those beautiful long braids shorn off. They were absolutely not allowed to speak their native tongue or practice their native religion, and if they did so, they risked suffering great punishment. White people just don't get this. White people don't get the lack of any kind of control that Native Americans had in their lives until 1978, when the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. When the government came for your child, if you were Native American, you could do nothing about it. For 100 years, Native American parents had to stand by helplessly and watch as their children were marched away to these government boarding schools.
I heard the screams, and I was part of the screams, and the running away, and the beatings, and the whippings by belts and leather and raping. I heard those screams. I hear it today. I said I would never forgive this government for allowing a policy like that to be inflicted upon us. And so historical trauma is still with us.
Was realizing how little I knew about the history of this country. You know, you might know, you might have a basic understanding of what happened that you learned in school. It's real peripheral. You know, it's very surface. And then upon reading these books, it made me realize, like, what happened here? Like, this is what happened here over the course of a couple hundred years is almost unprecedented in history. Like, that this nation was conquered by all these invaders that just kept coming in, kept changing the rules, kept breaking treaties, making treaties, breaking treaties, wiping people out, calling things battles when they were really just massacres of women and children. I mean, there's some horrendous stories of the justification of these massacres that were no different than any other horrific barbarian slaughter that you might have heard about in history that's looked down upon. But for years in this country, they were taught as if they were actual battles. I mean, the history of this country in regards to the tribes and the American settlers and the soldiers is terrifying. It's terrifying that this just happened a couple of hundred years ago, and that people are capable of these things, and that the ancestors of these people are just roaming around today. And that's what this country was founded on. This country was founded on massacre.
Where we make these people not like us disappear, or that we don't like disappear. We relocate them to a completely new geographic location, force them out of their lands, and basically supplant them. And, or as we've seen in the past, the complete annihilation of an entire ethnic group based upon hatred or dislike, dissimilarities. In assimilation societies, there is more conflict because there is mobility and competition for advancement. Our examples with the colonial or corporate, you're basically locked into a position, and in theory, things are fair and balanced, which will result in people being more happy.
That's all, folks.
12 years dungeon. All of you, dungeon. 7 years, no trial. Baby.